Who in Africa dares to speak the raw, unfiltered truth about why the continent has struggled for so long? How can a land so rich in resources remain so poor? Dr. Arikana didn't hold back. She fearlessly called out powerful individuals and exposed hidden truths that no one dared to touch. She didn't worry about being politically correct. Her focus was solely on what Africans needed to know. But what exactly did she say that captured the world's attention? Let's find out. Let's get straight to it. Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao just set the stage on fire with one of the most explosive speeches Africa has witnessed in recent years. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill diplomatic talk. No, it was a scorching, no-holds-barred call to action that left African leaders visibly shaken. Imagine a thunderstorm rolling into a quiet town, the kind that doesn't just pass through but leaves a trail of uprooted trees and shattered windows. That's the kind of impact Dr. Arikana had when she took the podium in South Africa. Now, let's break down the speech that's got everyone talking. Dr. Arikana wasn't content with merely pointing fingers at the age-old Western powers we've grown used to blaming for Africa's woes. Instead, she flipped the script in a way that no one saw coming. She put African leaders directly in the hot seat. In a room filled with some of the most influential figures on the continent, she pulled no punches, accusing these leaders of being the gatekeepers of Africa's misery. According to her, it's not just foreign powers that are bleeding Africa dry, it's the very people who claim to protect it. Here's where it gets interesting. Dr. Arikana likened the current crop of African elites to gatekeepers who have locked the continent in a cycle of dependency. Not on chains or whips, but on contracts, aid, and handouts. She argued that the real betrayal is not just the historical looting by colonial forces, but the modern-day sellout by African leaders who continue to sign deals that strip their nations of resources while filling their own pockets. "What's the price of loyalty to your people?" she asked, her voice resonating like a drumbeat. The room fell silent. It was the kind of question that hangs in the air long after it's been asked. Dr. Arikana went on to detail how some African leaders have essentially become gatekeepers for Western interests, betraying their citizens for a slice of the pie. But here's the thing, it's not even a real pie. It's the crumbs from the Western feast, while the continent remains starving.
The question is, our leadership is fully aware of the pillars of development. Our leaders are fully aware of the enemies to Africa's development, and yet somehow they're incapable of addressing them.
Dr. Arikana didn't stop there. She delivered a gut-wrenching metaphor that sent ripples through the audience. Africa is the goose that lays golden eggs, but our leaders are feeding it to the wolves. She laid bare how these leaders are not only failing to protect Africa's wealth, but are actively participating in the plunder, all in exchange for personal gain. According to her, it's not enough to point the finger outward. Africa needs to clean its own house first. In a move that truly hit home, she called for a complete overhaul of the leadership mindset on the continent. She urged the youth to rise, not with protests, but with education and innovation, to reclaim their future. "The time for begging is over," she declared. "We have everything we need within us to transform Africa. But first, we must be brave enough to call out our own." The room erupted in applause. But, let's be honest, it was the applause of those who had just been slapped awake. Dr. Arikana had made it clear, Africa's liberation won't come from foreign aid or trade agreements skewed in favor of the West. It will come from a new generation of leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo, break free from the mental chains of dependency, and finally put Africa's interests first. It was a rallying cry, not just to African leaders, but to every African who's tired of watching their continent's potential being siphoned away. Dr. Arikana's words were like a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truth that Africa's biggest obstacles may not always come from the outside. And now, the question remains, will the leaders she called out dare to step up, or will they continue to dance to the tune of foreign powers while Africa pays the price? Most importantly, are the leaders only to blame? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Dr. Arikana didn't stop at calling out African leaders alone. She turned her sharp criticism toward ECOWAS, the regional body that claims to protect West Africa's interests. To put it simply, she exposed ECOWAS as a toothless watchdog when it matters, and a fierce enforcer when it's convenient for foreign powers. Let's break it down. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, three West African nations, recently made headlines for military coups that overthrew their governments. The moment these countries took control of their destinies, ECOWAS was quick to jump in with threats of sanctions and military intervention. It's almost like ECOWAS was on standby, ready to act at the snap of a finger. But here's the question, Doctor. Arikana dared to ask, where was this urgency when these very countries were being drained of their resources by foreign powers like France? Take Niger as a glaring example. For decades, Niger's vast uranium reserves have been largely controlled by French companies, who profited while the people of Niger struggled with poverty. When the recent military government decided to reclaim control of its uranium industry, suddenly there were talks of sanctions and even military action from ECOWAS. Dr. Arikana pointed out the irony. Why is ECOWAS so quick to take action against fellow African nations trying to assert their independence, but completely silent when it comes to confronting Western powers that have been exploiting Africa's wealth? The hypocrisy doesn't end there. Dr. Arikana drew attention to how ECOWAS has been quick to mobilize its forces to punish African countries that refuse to follow the old colonial script. For instance, after the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, ECOWAS leaders gathered almost immediately, issuing statements, imposing sanctions, and even discussing military intervention. But when it comes to challenging the real forces draining Africa's resources, like France's decades-long grip on West Africa's economy, ECOWAS is conveniently quiet. She didn't hold back in describing ECOWAS as nothing more than a puppet for Western interests, suggesting that its true role isn't to protect African nations, but rather to enforce Western influence on the continent. Dr. Arikana highlighted that ECOWAS acts tough only when it's time to punish African nations that try to break free from these exploitative ties. But when the real villains, the foreign corporations and governments profiting off Africa's resources, come into play, ECOWAS suddenly goes missing. In her speech, Dr. Arikana questioned, why is ECOWAS so eager to act against its people, but silent when it's time to challenge those who have been stealing from Africa for centuries? It's a stark reality. ECOWAS appears more interested in keeping African nations in check rather than empowering them to stand up to outside exploitation. Dr. Arikana's words were a wake-up call, urging the audience to see through the charade. She argued that the real betrayal wasn't just from the outside forces exploiting Africa, but from African institutions like ECOWAS, which, instead of protecting their people, seem more interested in protecting the interests of their former colonial masters.
Oh, we can have a coup. I said, help me understand something. France has had coups against these nations for centuries. When France is forcing these countries to deposit their bank reserves with France, that's a coup, an economic coup. President Tinubu, what have you done about this coup? You are sitting on the big boy chair now. Talk to me. What are you going to do about...
The harsh reality she laid out was this. ECOWAS is more willing to deploy troops and enforce sanctions against its African brothers and sisters than it is to challenge the real enemies who have been draining the continent dry for generations. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but one that she insists Africa must face if it ever hopes to break free from its chains. Her call to action was clear. Africa's fight isn't just against the West, it's also against those within who have chosen comfort and complacency over true liberation. The question now is, will ECOWAS continue to serve as the gatekeeper for Western interests, or will it finally stand up for the people it claims to represent? Dr. Arikana wasn't done yet. If you thought she was finished stirring the pot, think again. This time, She went straight for the jugular, turning her focus to Africa's ongoing dependency on loans from Western financial institutions. Why? She asked the audience, her voice steady but forceful. Is a continent overflowing with natural resources still begging for money from Western banks? The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to justify this paradox. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral resources. We're talking gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, and more. Yet despite sitting on these vast reserves, African nations still line up, hat in hand, to beg for loans from the IMF and World Bank. And what do these loans get us? More debt, more control, and more strings attached. Western powers aren't handing out this money out of kindness. They're using it to tighten their grip on the continent. It's like a drug dealer handing out freebies. Just enough to keep you hooked, but never enough to set you free. Dr. Arikana called it out for what it is, a cycle of dependency. African leaders are like addicts who keep coming back for another fix, selling their people's futures for short-term gains. But it's not just about the loans. The real tragedy, as she pointed out, is that while African leaders are busy begging for scraps, the continent is hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Consider this. According to the African Development Bank, Africa loses over $50 billion annually to illicit financial flows. This is money siphoned off through tax evasion, shady deals, and corruption, with multinationals and a few corrupt officials at the helm. That's $50 billion that could have been invested in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and innovation. But instead, it's lining the pockets of foreign corporations and a few greedy officials. Dr. Arikana didn't stop there. She painted a stark picture of the hypocrisy. African countries lose billions through financial loopholes and corruption, but still dare to go knocking on the doors of the IMF and World Bank asking for loans. And let's not forget, these loans come with crippling conditions. Structural adjustment programs that force nations to cut spending on social services, privatize public assets, and open up markets to foreign exploitation. Take Zambia, for example. The country borrowed heavily to fund infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, you name it. But now, Zambia finds itself in a debt trap, struggling to pay off Chinese loans that were supposed to be investments in the country's future. Instead of economic freedom, Zambia is now stuck in a cycle of debt, with its sovereignty at risk as it negotiates with creditors. And this isn't just Zambia's story, it's a cautionary tale for the entire continent. Dr. Arikana put it bluntly. We have to stop pretending that foreign aid and loans are gifts. They are not. These are not acts of charity. They are calculated moves to keep Africa dependent and under control. The continent's leaders, she argued, need to wake up and realize that every loan signed, every aid package accepted, is another chain around Africa's neck. Her call to action was clear. Africa doesn't need to be begging for loans when it's sitting on a gold mine. The solution isn't in more foreign aid or loans. It's in taking control of our resources, stopping the financial leaks, and investing in our people. The real question is, will African leaders finally take charge of their destiny, or will they keep playing the role of beggars in a world where they should be kings? And where do locals come into this? Do they also have some responsibility? Dr. Arikana then turned to a subject that, according to her, is even more insidious than economic exploitation: mental colonization. She took a deep breath, scanned the room, and then dropped a truth bomb that hit everyone like a shockwave. Let's be honest with ourselves, she began. Colonialism never truly ended. It simply changed its face, its tactics. Her voice was filled with urgency as she painted a vivid picture of a continent that, despite gaining physical independence decades ago, is still mentally shackled by the remnants of colonial rule. Africans, she said with a piercing gaze, have been psychologically conditioned to believe that anything coming from the West is automatically superior. This, she argued, is a more dangerous form of control than any military or economic domination. Dr. Arikana laid out examples that many in the audience could not ignore. Take a look at our daily lives, she said. The way we dress, the brands we idolize, the languages we prioritize, even the history we teach our children. Everything reflects a mindset that places Western culture on a pedestal. This mentality, according to her, is what keeps Africa in a cycle of dependency. It's the invisible chain that holds a continent back, preventing it from realizing its true potential. Africa has rich cultural traditions, hundreds of languages, and a history filled with incredible achievements. Yet many Africans take pride in speaking English or French better than their native languages. Dr. Arikana didn't mince words when she called this out. She questioned why government officials boast about their fluency in these foreign languages, often viewing it as a mark of sophistication or intelligence. "What does it say about us?" she asked, "when we take more pride in mastering the language of our colonizers than in preserving our tongues?"
Minds that are free of the legacy of colonization and the legacy of slavery. As we speak today, we're all sick from the disease. None of us is exempt. And that's a fact. I'm going to ask each and every one of you to have a serious conversation with the image in the mirror. And ask yourself why you feel the way you do. Why are you automatically afraid of those who don't look like you? Why do you feel defeated? Why are you afraid to speak up and stand your ground?
But it's not just about language. Dr. Arikana delved into the content of African education systems, which are still heavily based on Western curriculums. From a young age, African children are taught more about European explorers like Columbus, Magellan, and Vasco da Gama than they are about African kings, queens, and warriors. "How many students in African schools," she asked, "learn about Mansa Musa, the wealthiest ruler in history, or Queen Nzinga, who fiercely resisted Portuguese colonization?" She pointed out that African history is often reduced to a few paragraphs, mostly focusing on colonialism, slavery, and poverty, while Europe's history is glorified. This selective teaching, she argued, is no accident. It's designed to keep Africans feeling inferior, as if their past is something to be ashamed of, rather than celebrated. "When you don't know your history," she emphasized, "you are doomed to believe the stories others tell you about yourself." Let's look at modern examples. Countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are filled with brilliant, innovative minds, and youth who are eager to make their mark on the world. Yet, these same young people are conditioned to believe that success means getting a degree from a Western university, wearing Western brands, and adopting Western lifestyles. Dr. Arikana highlighted that, despite having some of the best talent, Africa still suffers from a brain drain, where its brightest minds leave for the West in search of validation, instead of investing their skills back into their own countries. She used a powerful analogy to drive her point home. "It's like trying to win a race while cheering for the other team. As long as Africans continue to idolize everything Western, whether it's fashion, technology, education, or even beauty standards, they will never truly break free from the cycle of dependency." Dr. Arikana explained that this is exactly what Western powers want: Africans who are always looking to the West for approval, instead of realizing their worth and potential. She argued that as long as Africa remains mentally colonized, it will always be easy to manipulate, exploit, and control. To illustrate this, she brought up a story that resonated deeply with the audience. She recounted how, during a recent visit to a prestigious African university, she found that the curriculum was still heavily focused on Western theories, with little emphasis on local knowledge systems or African innovations. "How can we expect to develop African solutions to African problems," she asked, "if we're still teaching our students to think like Europeans?" Dr. Arikana passionately called for a revolution in African education, urging leaders to prioritize teaching African history, languages, and innovations. She argued that the first step to real independence is reclaiming the minds of Africa's youth. She pointed out that the continent cannot rely on Western education systems that are not designed to empower Africans, but to keep them looking outward for answers.
When are we going to wake up and realize that our inability to move forward as a people is because we were defeated where it matters the most? I'm so glad we're sitting here in an institution of higher learning. I'm going to ask you to say, what are we going to do about the educational curriculum? Because that's where it begins. They don't want us knowing our history. They don't want us knowing where we came from. Because if you are a person without a history...
Her call to action was both bold and inspiring. Africa doesn't need to keep looking to the West for validation. We have everything we need right here. Our resources, our people, and our rich cultural heritage. She urged African leaders, educators, and parents to stop glorifying Western standards and instead nurture a sense of pride in being African. In her final words, Dr. Arikana posed a challenging question. When will Africans stop admiring everything Western and start believing in their worth? Until that happens, she argued, Africa will remain trapped in a cycle of mental colonization, unable to fully break free and claim its rightful place on the global stage. Do you think African leaders will listen? Or will they continue to play their part in a script written by Western hands? Let us know in the comment section. Will Africa ever see freedom? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.